Is that the bill be now read the second time? Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I'm just going to rise briefly to say a couple of things. I wasn't necessarily going to speak on the bill, although I may have questions during the committee stage. The reason I wanted to rise was to actually speak in support of some of the things mentioned by the member for Hobart just now. And I haven't necessarily got entirely the same perspective on it, but I certainly think when we're forefronting the idea around a piece of legislation that we're considering, when we're forefronting the idea that we're cutting red tape, we do have to actually think that through very carefully and its impact. Because cutting red tape, although some people take that to be an automatic good, shouldn't just be considered an automatic good. Cutting red tape generally means cutting regulation of some sort or cutting processes of some sort that have been put in place. And the reason we generally put good governance processes in place or regulation in place is to balance public interest and private interest in the way we make decisions as a community and the way we govern ourselves as a community. And typically we do that thoughtfully to ensure that we don't constrain private interest more than is necessary, but that we also prioritise public interest and what will be in the public good and ensure that that isn't jeopardised. And that's a careful balancing act. We shouldn't automatically assume that cutting regulation or good process or good governance processes is an automatic public good, because typically those things have been put in place to ensure we're considering public good. In this case, with this bill, because we have had it put very much at the forefront that it is about cutting red tape, it is incumbent on us then to be thinking as we consider this bill, how are we changing the way we're balancing private interests and public interest and public good. And I agree that when the issue also centres around the environment, there are particular considerations there for us in that respect, because we would all, I think, agree that when it comes to making decisions about how we manage our environment, there are precautions we need to have in mind. In fact, there's a thing called the precautionary principle that we often have in mind when we're thinking about the environment, because we know that sometimes there are circumstances in which damage to the environment is irreparable. And once we reach that point, we can't have regret and wish that we'd changed our mind and been more precautionary at an earlier stage. It's too late. That's why we need to have those thoughts and those conversations and give consideration to those matters at the earliest stage and at every stage we propose change when we're making decisions about how we manage our environment, how we balance private interest with public good, and what is the right level of regulation around decision making and around processes in relation to the environment. There's nothing pejorative about there being red tape in place. Red tape in place means often serving the public interest. In this case, with this bill, it's certainly something I've turned my mind to in relation to some of the matters that are in there. When we remove from a decision-making process an element of public consultation, then that should be something that's only done with very careful consideration. This is part of being a community and a democracy, is that the community come to agreement about how we govern ourselves and how we deal with our environment, how we deal with our resources, how we agree to deal with private land use. Private land use isn't just a free-for-all. Just because you own the land doesn't mean you can do anything you want with it. There's all sorts of ways we constrain that as a community. If I have a piece of land, Mr President, I can't just suddenly decide to make it a tip, for instance, and have everybody come and dump rubbish on it as much as they like. Because we know that as a result of that, there will be impacts on the broader community, not just on the immediate neighbours inevitably, but also perhaps the broader community, and there'll be impacts of hygiene and all sorts of things. So we have rules around that. We have lots of rules around the way we use our private land. It isn't just ours to decide for ourselves. And often when we put those rules in place, we put elements in place in a decision-making process that allow the community more broadly, and sometimes with particular emphasis, those who will be directly impacted, an opportunity to A, be aware that changes or decisions are going to be made, and B, have the opportunity to have input or a say into that process. And then ultimately also often the right to appeal against decisions that are made or determinations that are made. Those are fundamental concepts to a functional democracy and a functional community. When we seek to remove those sorts of elements, we are reducing the democratic aspects of how we as a community make decisions. Personally, I believe we should do that with a great deal of care and diligence if we're going to be considering reducing those democratic elements of our community's decision-making processes. So in relation to this bill, it would be important, I think, for there to be a really clear case made as to why reducing those elements is necessary. And there would need to be a really clear case demonstrated as to the fact that doing so won't be detrimental to the fundamental principles of democracy and to community having the right, in terms of public interest, to have a say. I'm not sure that those cases have been well made out by the government in relation to this bill. I don't know that a clear problem was presented that needed to be fixed by reducing those opportunities and allowing certain things that used to have some constraint around them in terms of process to have that removed. So it certainly gives me pause in relation to this bill. I was interested to see the amendments circulated by the Greens that the member for Hobart has mentioned and that were presumably be proposed should we get to committee stage. I beg your pardon? Oh, it has certainly been circulated. I have it in my files. So
circulated a week or so ago.
Quite a while back, yep, plenty of time ago. Thank you for, in fact, a timely circulation of those amendments. It was useful to have time to think about them. I think it's not unreasonable, actually, to consider possible amendments where we might seek to think about going down the same path that the government's proposing this legislation, which is more streamlined processes, allowing some more leeway for there to be a lesser degree of community interaction around decision making, but to constrain the scope of what can be included. So that idea of, will it be 10% of the area of a private forest that's allowed to be expanded without public consultation, for example, or should it be less? Things like that, I think, all really important considerations, and I would encourage members to just be thinking about, by all means, think about reduction of red tape as a nice, convenient term, but whenever we hear that phrase or read that phrase, remember that what that's saying is the balance, how we balance and weigh private interest with public interest oftentimes. Yeah. And that's our job, to be thinking about that. So it is never inappropriate to be fully cognisant of public interest when we're making our decisions here, because that is our job, literally, as representatives of our communities. So really, Mr President, that was the extent of the thoughts I wanted to share on the bill, not so much to the detailed content of the bill, but the principles that it is based on and that I wanted to explicitly refer to in terms of my thinking on the bill and considerations when we get to committee stage and when we may, at that stage, consider amendments.
Question is the bill be now